The escape pod shook like a toy in the hands of an angry child as it fell through the thick atmosphere of the unknown planet. Taemin pressed his back against the metal wall and tried to keep his breathing steady, but the pod was spinning too fast. And the heat was getting worse by the second. Red warning lights flashed all around him, and the computer voice kept saying the same thing over and over again. Hull breach detected, life support, failing impact in 30 seconds. Taemin had been in bad situations before during his time as a Navy SEAL, but this was different this time. He was completely alone with no backup and no way to call for help. The pod hit the ground with a sound like thunder, and Taemin felt his whole body slam forward. Against the safety straps that held him in place, metal screamed and twisted around him as the pod bounced once, then twice, then finally came to rest against something that felt solid. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise, because it meant he was alive and now he had to figure out what to do. Neck smoke filled the small space, and Taemin could smell burning plastic and hot metal. He reached up and hit the emergency release button for his safety straps, and they snapped open. With a loud click, his whole body hurt, but nothing felt broken, which was better than he had expected. The main door was jammed shut, but there was an emergency hatch on the side that still worked. Taemin pushed it open and crawled out into air that was thick and hot and filled with smells he had never experienced before. The first thing he noticed was that everything was green, but not the normal green of earth plants. This was a deeper, darker green that seemed to glow with its own light. He stood up slowly and looked around at what had to be the strangest forest he had ever seen. The trees were huge, much bigger than any trees on Earth, and their leaves moved even though there was no wind. Some of the plants seemed to be watching him with what looked like eyes, and others made soft clicking sounds. When he got too close, the gravity felt heavier here, and each step took more effort than it should have. Taemin reached back into the pod and grabbed everything useful he could find. His combat knife, his service pistol with 2 magazines, some emergency food that would last maybe 3 days, water purification tablets, and a communication device that looked pretty badly damaged as he stood there taking inventory of his supplies. He heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a sound like screaming, but not human screaming, and it was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Taemin had heard animals make noise before, but this was different. This sounded intelligent and very, very angry. He decided to move away from the crash site because the smoke and noise would attract attention, and he was not ready to meet whatever lived in this place. The forest floor was covered with plants that seemed to reach for his feet as he walked, and more than once he had to use his knife to cut through vines that tried to wrap around his legs after walking for about an hour. Taemin found a good spot behind a massive tree trunk where he could watch the area around his crashed pod, and that was when he saw something that made him understand just how dangerous this place really was. A creature about the size of a rhinoceros was walking through the clearing where his pod had landed. It looked like a cross between a buffalo and an armored dinosaur with thick gray skin covered in bony plates and horns that curved forward from its massive head. The creature was just minding its own business, eating some of the strange glowing plants when something attacked it. At first, Taemin thought it was just a butterfly because that was what it looked like, a beautiful butterfly with wings that sparkled in the strange light of this alien sun. But when the butterfly landed on the big creature, something horrible happened. The butterfly wings were not soft like Earth butterfly wings. They were sharp like razor blades, and they cut through the thick armored skin of the big creature like it was made of paper. The creature tried to run, but the butterfly was too fast and too smart. It knew exactly where to cut to bring down something 50 times its size within minutes. The massive creature was dead, and the butterfly was feeding on its insides with what looked like tiny hands that came out of its body. Taemin watched in horror as more butterflies appeared from nowhere and joined in the feeding. They worked together like a team, each one knowing exactly what to do. That was when Taemin realized he was not just on an alien planet, he was on what the space travelers called a Deathworld, a place where evolution had gone crazy and created creatures so dangerous that even the smallest ones could kill a human in seconds. As the sun started to set, the forest began to change. Plants that had been closed during the day opened up to reveal rows of teeth. Some trees turned out to be animals that had been pretending to be trees. Other plants started glowing brighter and making sounds like they were calling to each other. Taemin found a spot in the roots of one of the giant trees where he could hide and watch. He ate some of his emergency food and tried to think about what to do next. The communication device was too damaged to send a signal, and even if it worked, nobody knew where he was. He had escaped from a military prison transport when it was attacked by pirates, but the escape pod had jumped to random coordinates to avoid capture. Now he was stuck on a planet that wanted to kill him with no way to call for help and only 3 days' worth of food. As the darkness got deeper, the sounds of the forest got louder and stranger. Taemin could hear things moving through the trees, things that sounded big and hungry. He gripped his knife tighter and tried to stay calm, but his heart was beating fast because he knew that the real test was just beginning. Something howled in the distance, and other things howled back like they were talking to each other. Taemin realized that the creatures of this world were not just dangerous. They were smart, and they hunted in groups, which meant his chances of surviving until morning were not very good. But Taemin was a Navy SEAL, and Navy SEALs did not give up. No matter how bad things got, he would find a way to survive on this death world, even if it killed him. The first morning on the death world taught Taemin that everything he thought he knew about survival was wrong. Back on Earth, he had been trained to hide from enemies and move without making noise, but here even the plants could hear him coming, and some of them wanted to eat him. He woke up when something wet dripped on his face from above. When he looked up, he saw a vine hanging down from the tree branches, and the vine had what looked like a mouthful of small, sharp teeth. The vine was dripping some kind of acid that burned his skin wherever it touched. Taemin rolled away from the tree roots where he had been sleeping and pulled out his knife. The vine followed his movement like it could see him even though it did not have any eyes. He cut the vine and green liquid sprayed everywhere, making the ground smoke where it landed. That was when he realized that even the trees on this planet were trying to kill him. He would have to learn completely new ways to stay alive, or he would be dead before the end of the week. For the next few days, Taemin moved through the forest like a student trying to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Every plant, every animal, every sound had to be studied and understood, because making one mistake would mean death. He learned that the bright-colored flowers were the most dangerous ones because they shot poisonous darts at anything that came too close. He learned that some of the trees would try to grab him with their branches if he walked underneath them. He learned that the safest time to move was during the middle of the day when most of the big predators were sleeping. But the strangest thing was that after a few days the animals started acting differently around him. A pack of 6-legged wolves had been following him for 2 days, staying just out of sight but never attacking. When he finally turned around to face them, they stopped and stared at him for a long time, then slowly backed away. The same thing happened with a giant snake that had crystal scales and eyes like yellow fire. The snake followed him for an entire day, but every time Taemin stopped and looked directly at it, the snake would freeze like it was not sure what to do. Then it would slide away into the bush. At first Taemin thought maybe these creatures were just being careful because they did not know what kind of animal he was. But then he started to notice something else. The way they looked at him was not the way a predator looks at prey. It was the way one predator looks at another predator when it is not sure who would win in a fight. On his 5th day on the planet, Taemin had his first real test. A creature that looked like a cross between a gorilla and a praying mantis came crashing through the forest, heading straight for him. This thing was twice his size, with arms that ended in blades instead of hands, and it was moving fast. Instead of running or trying to hide, Taemin did something that surprised even himself. He stood his ground, pulled out his combat knife, and looked the creature straight in the eyes. The creature stopped about 10 feet away from him, and they stared at each other for what felt like forever. The creature had every advantage. It was bigger, stronger, faster, and had natural weapons that could cut Taemin in half. But something made it hesitate. Something about the way Taemin stood there without fear made the creature think twice about attacking. After 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, the creature slowly backed away, keeping its eyes on Taemin the whole time. When it was far enough away, it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Taemin standing there with his heart beating like a drum. That night, as Taemin sat in his makeshift camp, he started to understand what was happening. The animals on this planet could smell things that humans could not smell. They could sense things about other creatures that told them who was dangerous and who was Not humans had climbed to the top of the food chain on Earth, not because they were the biggest or the strongest, but because they were the smartest. They used tools and worked together and never gave up even when things looked hopeless. The animals on this Deathworld could somehow sense that about himward was spreading through the forest about the strange new creature that had crashed from the sky. Animals talked to each other in ways that humans could not understand. They used smells and sounds and chemical signals to share information. The message being passed around was simple. There was a new predator in the forest, and this predator was different from anything they had ever seen before. It was small and had no natural weapons, but it carried the scent of something that had fought its way to the top of its own world. Some of the smaller predators started avoiding the areas where Taemin had been. Some of the bigger ones started watching him from a distance, trying to figure out what kind of threat he represented. All of them could sense that he was not just another prey animal stumbling through their territory. Taemin began to realize that his biggest advantage was not his weapons or his training. It was the fact that he came from a planet where survival meant being smarter than everything else. Earth had produced a species that could adapt to any environment and find a way to win even when the odds were against them. The animals of this Deathworld had never encountered anything like that before. They were used to creatures that were either predators or prey with clear rules about who ate whom. But humans did not fit into those categories. Humans were something new, and that made them dangerous in ways the local wildlife could not understand. By the end of his first week, Taemin had established a routine. He would move during the middle of the day when it was safest. He would find shelter before dark and set up simple alarms using sticks and stones to warn him if anything approached. During the night, he would eat only plants that he had seen other animals eat, and he would never stay in the same place for more than one night. More importantly, he had started to learn the language of the forest. The different calls that meant danger, the smells that meant a big predator was nearby, the signs that told him which areas were safe and which ones would get him killed. The forest was starting to accept him not as prey, but as something that belonged there, something that had earned the right to exist in their world through intelligence and determination rather than size and strength. 3 weeks after crashing on the Deathworld, Taemin encountered something that made all his previous experiences look like practice rounds. It was the creature that ruled this part of the forest, and it was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The first sign that something big was watching him came when all the normal forest sounds suddenly stopped. The insects stopped buzzing, the small animals stopped moving through the bush, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Taemin had learned that when a Deathworld goes quiet, it means something very dangerous is nearby. He was collecting water from a stream when he felt eyes on him. He turned around slowly and saw it standing in the shadows between the trees. It was the size of a small building with a body like a tiger, but covered in scales instead of fur. Its head was shaped like a dragon from old Earth stories, with horns that curved back along its skull and teeth as long as Taemin was tall. The creature did not attack immediately. Instead, it just stood there watching him with eyes that glowed like green fire. Those eyes held an intelligence that was almost human, and Taemin realized he was looking at the apex predator of this forest, the king of all the deadly creatures that lived here. For several minutes, neither of them moved. The creature could have killed Taemin in seconds, but something held it back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it sensed the same thing the other animals had sensed, that this small human was more dangerous than he appeared. Finally, the creature turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest without making a sound. But Taemin knew this was not over. The creature had been studying him, learning about him, and deciding what to do about the stranger in its territory. Over the next few days, the creature played a deadly game of cat and mouse with Taemin. It would appear at the edge of his vision, then vanish. When he turned to look, it would leave huge claw marks on trees near where he slept. It would kill large prey animals and leave them in his path like messages. The message was clear. This forest belonged to the creature, and Taemin was here only because it allowed him to be here. But the creature was also testing him, trying to figure out what kind of threat he represented and whether he was worth the effort of killing. Taemin knew that eventually they would have to face each other. He spent days preparing for that moment, gathering materials and making plans. He could not win a direct fight against something that size But humans had never won through brute force, they won by being smarter than their enemies. The confrontation came on a cloudy morning in a clearing surrounded by the largest trees in the forest. The creature was waiting for him when he arrived, sitting on its haunches like a giant cat. Its green eyes never left him as he walked into the open space. Tamin did not try to look bigger or more threatening than he was. Instead, he did something that no other creature on this planet would have thought to do. He showed the apex predator what it meant to be human. From his pack he pulled out the tools he had made over the past weeks: a spear with a metal point taken from his crashed pod, a sling made from salvaged fabric that could throw stones with deadly accuracy, a bow made from flexible wood with arrows tipped with sharp metal. But more than just weapons, he showed the creature fire. He had learned to make fire using friction and dry plant material, and now he lit a small blaze in the center of the clearing. Fire was something that did not exist naturally on this world, and the creature had never seen anything like it. The apex predator watched as Tamin demonstrated human technology. He showed how humans could make tools to extend their reach and multiply their strength. He showed how they could control the elements and reshape their environment to meet their needs. Most importantly, he showed the creature intelligence. In action, he took apart one of the complex plants that grew in the clearing and rebuilt it in a different way, showing how humans could understand and manipulate the natural world. He created a simple machine using sticks and vines that could lift heavy objects, demonstrating the human ability to use physics as a weapon. Through all of this, the creature watched and learned. It began to understand that it was not facing just another animal. It was facing a representative of a species that had conquered an entire planet, not through size or strength, but through the power of their minds. When Tamin finished his demonstration, he stood quietly and waited. The creature studied him for a long time, its ancient intelligence processing what it had witnessed. Finally, it stood up and walked slowly toward him. For a moment, Tamin thought he had made a terrible mistake. The creature was close enough now to kill him with a single swipe of its massive claws, but instead of attacking, the creature did something unexpected. It lowered its great head and looked directly into Tamin's eyes. In that moment, they understood each other. The creature recognized that Tamin represented something that could eventually claim dominion over any world given enough time. It was not afraid of Tamin individually, but it respected what he represented: a species that turned intelligence into the ultimate weapon. The creature backed away slowly, then turned and walked into the forest. When it was gone, the normal sounds of the jungle returned, and Tamin knew that something fundamental had changed. He had not conquered the apex predator through violence. He had earned its respect through demonstration of what made humans unique in the galaxy. From that day forward, the balance of power in the forest shifted. The apex predator had acknowledged that there was room for another kind of ruler, one who ruled through intelligence rather than strength. Word of this spread through the complex network of animal communication, and every creature in the forest began to see Tamin differently. He was no longer just a strange animal that had fallen from the sky. He was now recognized as something that belonged at the top of the hierarchy, something that had earned its place through the most dangerous weapon of all, the human mind. After his confrontation with the apex predator, everything in the forest changed for Tamin. Animals that had once seen him as either prey or competitor now treated him with a respect he had never experienced. The change was so dramatic that he began to understand he had become part of something much larger than his own survival. The apex predator had spread word through the jungle using methods of communication that Tamin was only beginning to understand. Chemical signals carried through the air told every creature for miles around that the strange human was under protection. Territorial boundaries that had been established over thousands of years suddenly included a new zone around wherever Tamin chose to make camp. He decided to establish a permanent base in the ruins of what appeared to be an ancient structure built by some long-dead alien race. The building was made of a material he could not identify, but it was still strong after who knows how many years. Half of it was covered by jungle growth, but the other half provided excellent shelter. The location was perfect. It sat at the intersection of several animal territories, which meant it had always been neutral ground. Now it became Tamin territory, and the local wildlife seemed to accept this arrangement. The stream that ran nearby provided fresh water, and the ruins offered protection from the worst Whether within days of moving into the ruins, Taman noticed something amazing happening. Prey animals began to graze closer to his territory because they instinctively understood that the big predators would not hunt in the area. The smaller predators found that they could hunt more successfully because the larger threats stayed away. What surprised Taman most was that he had become what scientists called a keystone species. His presence was changing the entire ecosystem in ways that no single animal should be able to do. The forest was reorganizing itself around him, and the result was a more stable balance than had existed before he began to modify his living space using skills he had learned in the military and materials he gathered from the jungle. He created tools and weapons that were far more advanced than anything the local wildlife had ever seen. Each improvement served two purposes: making his life easier and demonstrating to the watching animals that humans could reshape any environment to meet their needs. The jungle creatures observed everything he did with fascination that bordered on reverence. They watched him build furniture from salvaged metal and living wood. They watched him create complex traps that could catch prey without harming it. They watched him cultivate certain plants while removing others too. Create a garden that produced food year-round. Some of the more intelligent animals began to copy his methods. A family of creatures that looked like a cross between monkeys and ravens started using tools after watching Taman work. Several species began storing food for lean times after seeing how he preserved meat and plant matter for future use. But the most significant change was in the forest social structure. Predators that had fought each other for territory for generations now maintained peaceful boundaries. The apex predator had made it clear that disrupting the new balance would not be tolerated, and every animal in the jungle understood what that meant. Taman realized he had accidentally created something that had never existed on this world before: a stable ecosystem where conflict was managed through intelligence rather than constant violence. The jungle was still dangerous, but it was no longer chaotic. Every creature now had a role to play in maintaining the balance. He established routines that helped reinforce this new order. Each morning he would walk the boundaries of his territory, not to patrol them, but to be seen. The animals needed to know he was still there, still maintaining his part of the agreement. Each evening he would return to the ruins and work on projects that demonstrated human ingenuity. The jungle began to depend on his presence. Young predators that might have challenged established alphas instead learned to coexist. Prey animals reproduced more successfully because predation pressure was reduced and better managed. Resources that had been wasted in territorial disputes were now used more efficiently, but Taman also understood that this balance was fragile. It depended on his continued presence and his ability to maintain the respect he had earned. The moment he showed weakness or made a serious mistake, the entire system could collapse into chaos worse than what had existed before. He began to prepare for challenges he knew would come. Other creatures from outside his territory would eventually test the new order. Young animals would grow up and need to establish their own place in the hierarchy, and there was always the possibility that something would happen to him leaving the ecosystem without its stabilizing force. The ruins became not just his home, but a symbol of what humans could accomplish. They represented the idea that intelligence could triumph over brute force, that cooperation could be more powerful than competition, and that even the most hostile environment could be transformed into something better. Every day brought new proof that the forest had accepted him as more than just another predator. He was now seen as a guardian of the balance, a creature whose presence made life better for everyone. The jungle had evolved for millions of years without ever experiencing anything like human intelligence, and the results of that first contact were beyond anything Taman had imagined. As weeks passed, he began to understand that his survival on this Deathworld was about more than just staying alive. He had accidentally proven something important about humanity, about their ability to create order from chaos and build something better than what they found. The ecosystem that had formed around him was not perfect, but it was stable and it was growing stronger every day. The jungle had learned that there was more than one way to be an apex predator, and that sometimes the most dangerous creature was the one that chose not to fight. 2 months after establishing his territory, Taman faced his greatest challenge yet. The delicate balance he had created was about to be tested by a coalition of younger predators who had grown tired of the new order they had not chosen. The first Sign of trouble came when his morning walk revealed fresh territorial markings that had not been there the day before. Claw marks on trees sent posts in places where they did not belong and kill sites that seemed designed to send a message. The message was clear: the new generation was not willing to accept the arrangement their elders had made with the human. Over the next few days, the signs multiplied. Hunting trails that had been abandoned for weeks suddenly showed fresh activity. Water sources that had been neutral ground were claimed by creatures that had no right to them. Most disturbing of all, the smaller animals that had grown comfortable near his territory began to disappear. Min recognized what was happening. A group of young predators was forming an alliance against him. They were too young to remember the time before his arrival, when the forest had been locked in constant conflict. All they knew was that their natural instincts told them to challenge any alpha that was not of their own species. The coalition was led by a pack of 6 intelligent reptilian creatures that looked like a cross between wolves and velociraptors. They were each about the size of a large dog, but they hunted with coordination that rivaled human military tactics. They had recruited other young predators to their cause, creating a force that could threaten even the great apex predator if they worked together. The first direct attack came at dawn on a day when thick fog covered the forest floor. Taemin woke to the sound of movement all around the ruins. At least 20 different creatures moving through the mist with deadly purpose. They had surrounded his territory during the night, and now they were closing in for the kill. But Taemin had not survived 3 weeks on a Deathworld by being unprepared. The ruins were not just his home, they were a fortress that he had been improving since the day he moved in. Every entrance was trapped, every approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire, and every room had multiple escape routes. The attackers expected to find a soft human hiding in his shelter. Instead, they found themselves entering a maze of carefully planned death traps. The first group to reach the main entrance triggered a deadfall that crushed 2 of them instantly. The second group found themselves tangled in nets made from salvaged cable that tightened when they struggled. The reptilian pack leaders were smart enough to learn from these mistakes. They pulled back and began to probe his defenses more carefully, sending smaller groups to test different approaches while the main force waited for intelligence about weak points. For 5 days and nights, the siege continued. Wave after wave of attacks tested every aspect of Taemin defenses. They tried stealth attacks under cover of darkness. They tried direct assaults during the day. They even tried to poison his water supply using toxic plants they had learned to process. But Taemin had advantages that no other creature on the planet possessed. He could think several moves ahead, planning counters to attacks that had not happened yet. He could use the attacker's own instincts against them, turning their pack hunting behavior into a weakness by making them compete with each other for the honor of killing him. The turning point came when Taemin did something that shocked every creature participating in the siege. He captured one of the reptilian pack leaders alive using a trap that stunned rather than killed. The other attackers expected him to torture and kill the captured leader as any normal predator would do. Instead, Taemin did something that had never been seen before on this world. He treated the creature wounds, gave it food and water, and then after 3 days he released it unharmed back to its pack. The psychological impact of this act was devastating to the coalition. Every predator on the planet understood violence. They understood dominance through strength, and they understood the law of kill or be killed. But mercy was a concept that did not exist in their world. The idea that a creature could have complete power over an enemy and choose not to use it was beyond their comprehension. The captured leader returned to its pack carrying chemical signals that told the story of what had happened. It had been defeated, captured, and held prisoner. But instead of being killed, it had been treated better than it had ever been treated by its own kind. The human had demonstrated absolute power and then chosen restraint. This act of controlled violence, followed by unexpected compassion, created cracks in the coalition. Some of the younger predators began to question whether they really wanted to challenge a creature that could show such power. Some of the older ones remembered stories their parents had told them about the time before the human, when the forest had been soaked in blood. The siege collapsed when the reptilian pack leaders made a fatal mistake. They tried to coordinate a final assault from 3 directions at once, but their communication broke down when several coalition members refused to participate. The attack became a confused mess that Taemin easily defeated using tactics he had learned in human military training. When the surviving attackers retreated into the forest, they carried with them a new understanding of what it meant to challenge the human. He was not just another predator competing for resources, he was something entirely different, something that could choose when to show mercy and when to show strength. The jungle ecosystem that had formed around Taemin became stronger after surviving this test. The creatures that had remained loyal to the new order were rewarded with better hunting grounds and safer territories. The ones that had joined the coalition found themselves excluded from the benefits that came with the human protection. More importantly, the failed rebellion sent a message throughout the forest that reached far beyond Taemin's immediate territory. The human was not a temporary disruption to the natural order. He was a permanent part of the ecosystem, and any creature that wanted to survive would have to find a way to coexist with him. The apex predator, which had remained neutral during the siege, now took a more active role in maintaining the balance. It began to enforce the boundaries that protected Taemin territory, making it clear that any future challenges would have to go through the forest original ruler first. In the weeks that followed the siege, Taemin noticed that his relationship with the jungle had changed again. He was no longer just a strange creature that had earned respect. Through intelligence, he was now seen as a proven leader, one who had been tested in battle and found worthy of the position. He held the forest, had learned that humans did not rule through fear or violence alone. They ruled through a combination of intelligence, compassion, and strategic use of force. When necessary, they could be more deadly than any natural predator, but they could also show mercy that transformed enemies into allies. This lesson would spread beyond the immediate area carried by animals that migrated to other parts of the planet. Soon other regions would hear about the human who had tamed a Deathworld, not through conquest but through the revolutionary idea that intelligence could create something better than endless violence. 4 months after his crash landing, Taemin woke to a sound he had not heard since leaving Earth, the deep rumble of spacecraft engines cutting through atmosphere. A rescue ship was finally coming for him, but as he watched it descend toward a clearing near the ruins, he realized that his rescue would be more complicated than he had expected. The ship landed with precision that spoke of military training, and Taemin could see armed figures moving around the landing site. They were setting up a defensive perimeter, which was smart given what they thought they knew about Deathworlds, but they had no idea what kind of world this had become. Commander Hyjin was the first person to emerge from the ship without a weapon. She had been briefed about Taemin's situation, and she expected to find either a barely surviving human clinging to life in a hostile environment, or more likely just his remains and the wreckage of his escape pod. What she found instead would change everything humanity thought it knew about their place in the galaxy. The first sign that something was different came when her team's motion sensors detected movement all around the landing site. Lots of movement, big things moving through the forest with purpose and intelligence, but instead of attacking, the creatures seemed to be taking up defensive positions. Hyjin ordered her team to advance toward the ruins where Taemin's signal was strongest, but they had only gone a few hundred meters when they encountered something that stopped them in their tracks. The great apex predator emerged from the forest and positioned itself directly in their path. The creature was magnificent and terrifying, standing twice as tall as a human, with scales that gleamed like armor and eyes that held ancient intelligence. It made no aggressive moves, but its message was clear. It was protecting something, and it would not allow the newcomers to pass without permission. Before Hyjin could decide how to handle this situation, Taemin appeared, walking calmly out of the forest as if he were taking a morning stroll. He moved with confidence that spoke of complete familiarity with his environment, and when he gestured to the great creature, it stepped aside to let him pass. The reunion between Taemin and his rescuers was unlike anything in the history of human space exploration. They had come to save a survivor, but instead they found a human who had become something unprecedented. He had not just survived on a Deathworld. He had become part of its ecosystem. Jin and her team watched in amazement as Taemin communicated with creatures that should have been trying to kill him. He used hand signals and body language that he had learned over months of careful observation. He made sounds that mimicked the calls different species used to talk to each other. Most Incredible of all the creatures responded to him with what could only be described as respect. They brought him gifts of food and interesting objects they had found. They showed him their young as if seeking his approval. They treated him not as a master but as an equal member of their community. The implications of what they were seeing began to sink in as Hyjin interviewed Taemin about his experiences. This was not just a survival story. This was proof that humans possessed something unique in the galaxy. The ability to establish dominance through intelligence rather than force. Word of Taemin discovery spread through human space faster than any news. In recent memory, intelligence agencies, military commanders, and scientists all wanted to understand how a single human had accomplished something that entire armies had failed to do on other hostile worlds, the planet that had been designated as just another uninhabitable Deathworld was suddenly reclassified as a potential strategic asset. Taemin had proven that humans could not only survive in the galaxy's most hostile environments but could actually improve them through their presence as the rescue ship prepared to leave. Taemin faced the hardest decision of his life. The creatures that had become his family were clearly distressed by his departure. They had grown dependent on the stability his presence provided, and they did not understand why he had to leave. The great apex predator approached him one final time, and in a gesture that brought tears to the eyes of the watching humans, it gently touched his forehead with its massive snout. It was saying goodbye in the only way it knew how, acknowledging that their time together had changed both of them. When the ship finally lifted off carrying Taemin back to human civilization, the ecosystem he left behind began to adapt to his absence. The territorial boundaries shifted, but the stability remained. The creatures had learned that there was more than one way to be an apex predator, and that lesson would survive long after the human, who taught it, was gone. Back in human space, Taemin found himself at the center of a revolution in how humanity viewed itself. In the galaxy, military strategists realized that Earth evolution had produced something unique, a species that could turn any environment, no matter how hostile, into something they could call home. The story of the Navy SEAL who walked into a Deathworld alone and made every apex predator back away in silence became legend. But more than that, it became proof that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or their numbers. It was their ability to create order from chaos, to build bridges instead of walls, and to show that intelligence tempered with wisdom could accomplish what brute force never could. Scientists, studying the data from Taemin's experience, began to understand that humans were not just another species trying to find their place among the stars. They were something new in the galaxy, something that could bring stability and progress to worlds that had known only violence and chaos for millions of years. The Deathworld that had nearly killed Taemin became the first of many hostile environments, where humans would prove that they belonged not as conquerors, but as gardeners capable of making any world bloom with the simple application of intelligence, compassion, and the revolutionary idea that cooperation was stronger than competition. And somewhere in the depths of space, on a planet now designated as a strategic research site, the creatures that had learned to trust a human continued to thrive in the ecosystem he had helped them build, waiting for the day when others like him might return to continue the work he had started.